these 100% environmentalistic views. Let me quote you just two statements, which in fact I quote in my book. One is from the US Department of Labor, which declares that intelligence potential is distributed among Negro infants in the same proportion and pattern as among Icelanders or Chinese or any other group. There is absolutely no question of any genetic differential. In other words, they are certain they know the answer. I'm not.
Professor Penrose, I think you question the way Jensen and Eysenck have handled the data, especially perhaps or for example on twins.
Yes, I think I would criticize from my reading of the papers the excessive amount of influence they give to heredity, which is mainly based on the twin data, which gives you a figure of something like 75 to 80% if you take it on its face value. But it's known from other types of work that twin data are rather unreliable from just this point of view, that they are peculiar. Twins are odd, different from the rest of the family, and of course, in any case, identical twins have the same environment until they're born, and you can't control that. The other point is purely technical, too, and that is that it's a very interesting and I think important matter which Professor Eysenck does mention, but doesn't go into very deeply, that there's a very strong likeness between parent and parent, in almost any character you like to take. This was shown, of course, by Carl Pearson originally in things like stature, hair color, eye color, and you can do it with anything else. And with intelligence, it's about the highest of all, something like 0.6. And for this, you need to make a very big correction in your analysis of the data on the likeness of brothers and sisters, which I understand that I couldn't see that they either Professor Eysenck or Dr. Jensen had made.
Professor Bodmer, I think you also question Eysenck's minimization of hereditary differences.
Yes, I think Professor Eysenck places a lot of emphasis on the difficulty of finding plausible environmental factors that could explain the observed IQ difference between US blacks and whites. And I thought it might be useful to mention one or two rather striking environmental effects, which, though not directly related to that environmental difference, point out the difficulty of defining the environment and those aspects of it that might affect IQ. It's well known from a number of studies that if you look at the IQ of twins and compare it with non-twins, that there's an average difference of about 5 points, which is a big difference. I mean, it's of the order of a third of the whole difference between the races in the States. And this difference seems to be the same at whatever socioeconomic level you look at, and it doesn't seem to be dependent on maternal age or birth weight. Another example of a very marked environmental effect comes from studies which are often used by geneticists to look at genetic components of things like IQ, namely looking at adopted children brought up in foster homes away from their two parents. And mostly one quotes correlations of the IQ of these children with their two parents and with their adopted parents, and you don't often see data comparing the mean IQs themselves. And in fact, one well-known study in the States showed that the IQ of the adopted children who were adopted into homes in general terms of a much higher socioeconomic background was something like 20 points higher than that of their two mothers. And even if you allow for something that geneticists call regression to the mean, you still end up with a difference that's almost the same as the difference between the races. And I just think that these points are worth emphasizing as examples of subtle environmental factors which can by no means excluded in the difference between the races, quite apart from any questions of criticism of the genetic studies themselves.
Eysenck?
I make this point very strongly in my book. I say that environmentalists have really let us down by not investigating and suggesting other factors that might be looked at. It seems on a priori grounds, rather unlikely that when these very marked differences in schooling, socioeconomic status and so on, do not reduce the differences very much, that other more refined ones might do so. But of course it's perfectly possible, and I have pleaded with them, in fact, in my book, to make specific suggestions that can be tested.
Can the genetic component be separated experimentally, you think?
Well, I don't think so. I think Professor Eysenck has covered himself in a sense on this by making cautionary statements. Nevertheless, he does seem to think that there are, or very shortly will be, experimental techniques that would do this. But in principle, there is only one technique that we know of that will do this, and that is to transplant members of one group into the same environment as the members of the other group. Now, we can't do that if there is a morphological criterion of race, like skin color, which the particular social culture recognizes, because we are not transplanting into the environment, shall we say, of whites to blacks or blacks to whites. Professor Eysenck makes a suggestion which he thinks would get over this problem, which is to correlate IQ with a degree of ancestry from white and black peoples in those where their ancestry can be well enumerated. But I would suggest that this just won't work, because for it to work, it must, you must have the strict random sampling of those whites who married blacks from the white population, those blacks who married whites from the black population. And I suggest that the racial mixture was from random samples of the two races is highly implausible.
Now, Dr. Martin Richards, as a psychologist, you consider Eysenck and Jensen's work to be a legitimate task for psychologists?
My answer simply is no. This is not because I wish to suppress research on race. I should say that very firmly. I think there are many interesting and important problems we should look at. But in his book on race and IQ, Professor Eysenck says that what we should be interested in are individuals. He says that there are many educational problems that we know very little about, and much research remains to be done. All that I would agree with, but I would just like to ask him a very simple question. Having said the individual counts, why discuss all these studies in which groups of individuals are compared on an average score in an IQ test? My point really is quite simple, that you can score anyone you like in the world on an IQ test, you can divide up the world in any way you like, and you can calculate mean IQs. But to say that the mean IQ of blacks is 80 tells us nothing about how any one black person develops intelligence. There are large numbers of questions we don't know anything about how intelligence develops in the individual. And I would argue that the kind of research that Eysenck is quoting and suggesting we should go on doing will not answer those questions. What he's done in his book is to summarize a body of data which was produced by a group of psychologists, mostly before the last war. They were psychologists who believed Negroes to be inferior to whites. The question they asked is, how inferior are they? He summarized this as if it has some relevance to this question about the development of intelligence in the individual. My argument quite simply is it has no relevance. It's basically a racist kind of psychology. We've got over that. We're now interested in some real questions about the development of intelligence in individuals. IQ testing of groups or comparing groups on IQ tests will not answer those questions.
Different people are interested in different things. I don't see why one should necessarily deprecate what someone else is doing, because it isn't what oneself would like to do. Well, furthermore, I don't think it is quite fair to smear all the people who did this research as starting out with a firm belief in the inferiority of Negroes, and I suppose you know the majority of them, and you don't know what they believed in before and after. I think this is a typical smear technique, an argumentum ad hominem, which I don't think does you any credit. furthermore, I don't think the major studies in this field have been done before the war. They have been done in the last few years, the greatest and the most important ones at least.
John Vasey, I think you're worried about the definitions of the basic terms used in this discussion, race, education, and so forth.
Yes, my problem as an economist, when I read this book and all the literature which is associated with it, is that I suddenly found that the lady was protesting too much. Professor Eysenck is a scientist who used the word science or scientist on average 3 times per page in the book. This suggested to me that he was very concerned about his scientific status. And when I then came down very carefully to look at the scientific concepts he was using, I frankly thought they were unbelievable. He uses race in the sense in which geneticists use the word as a gene pool, a population. But the studies he quotes from are race used in a social term, in the same way, for example, studies of Jews would use the word race. Secondly, he talks about culture and environment in an extraordinarily loose way. Anybody who's ever taken care to study the sociology of environments will realize that this is just not a very simple concept, it's a very complicated concept. Thirdly, he talks about his IQ tests as if they're measuring intelligence. Though we know they're not. They're measuring IQ tests. And to correlate... To correlate this IQ stuff with something meaningful in life, or something about education, is, of course, the subject of intense dispute among scientists. And just one last example, what really gave me the clue to what was up, if I may move away from the black-white thing, to talk about the Irish, about which I happen to know quite a lot. It's a well-known fact that the Irish, measured in Ireland, are more stupid than the rest of the people in this island. And the argument which is used in this book is that the intelligent ones emigrated. Well, anybody who's ever studied Irish history knows that this is exactly the reverse, in fact, occurred. It was the bright people stayed at home, the stupid ones were sent abroad. So you see, what is here quite clear is that there is a pseudo-scientific argument, which isn't a genuine scientific argument at all, because it's all measuring things which are extraordinarily loosely defined.
That's right.
I'm happy to see that Dr. Vasey knows the IQ of the Irish who emigrated. Otherwise, how could he know whether they were bright or dull? It seems an odd thing to posit at the time. I didn't make any assertion. I suggested it as one possible explanation of the facts. No, I would like to take up the point about IQs and whether they measure intelligence. The very way the argument is put seems to me quite erroneous. It assumes that there is such a thing, reified as intelligence, which we poor dopes don't succeed in measuring with our IQ tests. So that, of course, is a completely meaningless kind of statement. That's why I mentioned gravitation and the various other physical concepts. These are gradually attained through an improvement in conceptualization and measurement and so on. They don't start out with knowing what gravitation. We still don't know what gravitation is. We can measure certain aspects relating. It's exactly the same with intelligence. There is not such a thing which we then either succeed or do not succeed in measuring.
I would like, if I could, to bring up one other point that is a parallel one to the question of the Irish. And one of the explanations that's often made in the difference between US blacks and whites is that it must be due to some sort of selection at the time that the slaves were recruited, so to speak, in Africa and brought over to the States. And you in your book make the suggestion, which is more extreme than that has usually been made, that this selection took place solely at the times that the slaves were actually found, because you say that the less bright ones were found, and I can quote you on this, and you also say that tribal chiefs may have sold off their less intelligent members. Well, there is a theory that geneticists use. It's based on the same assumptions that gives rise to all the other measures of heritability. And I've calculated, based on the heritability values which are usually used, how much selection would be needed in one generation, as you suggest is a plausible explanation for the difference, to get a 15-point IQ difference. And my calculations, which are very simple, show that you'd have to pick only the bottom 5% with respect to IQ. And I suggest that attributes to the tribal chiefs and the people who were collecting slaves a remarkable ability to do IQ tests in the 19th century.
May I just say the argument is quite invalid. Could I just finish the argument?
Professor, to add a point to go with it.
Professor Thoda, if it's the same point.
It is the same point, essentially, that your postulate about the Irish implies there must be some incredibly bright Irish population somewhere.
Professor Eysenck.
I was not, of course, suggesting this as the only or even the main reason for the observed differences at the moment. I suggested, among others, that possibly there was a long period of selection in the states when the brighter ones were killed off, say, for running away to the north and various other causes. In other words, the argument just doesn't hold. This is one possible explanation. I don't want to stick with it. I'm not particularly concerned with it. Whatever the reason may be, I'm concerned with the facts. This is one suggested possibility.
If I could just continue on the point that Martin Richards made here, which is one perhaps of opinion, is you quote Jensen again as saying this is an important problem, and I've dealt with Professor Shockley in the United States, who's argued that the United States should spend the sort of money that they did in putting a man on the moon in solving this problem of the genetic differences between the races. And I'd like to challenge you, as Martin Richards did again, why do you think this is important? What practical use at all can be made, even if you do find an average genetic difference? It seems to me no use can be made of this at all.
Why do you think this is important?
Well, in the first place, everybody seems to consider it important because there's been a tremendous debate going on over several years involving...
People like yourself and Jensen who make it important by bringing it up.
Nobody else.
Look, some of us are trying to do research.
Do you mind if I
We're
finish?
interested in education. We're
Let's-
interested...
Let's just, no, I don't think he quite finished his sentence. Let him do that, then we'll come back to it.
It is quite untrue that only Jensen and I are interested in this. Obviously, this is a tremendous problem at the moment in the States, and the U.S. government is very much concerned with it. It has been hearing testimony for several years on this point. Do you mind if I finish what I was saying?
Please.
The American government has been very much concerned with this and has been hearing evidence over a period of years, including Dr. Jensen, who, as you know, was very much in favor of desegregation. It obviously is a very real problem in the States. It is a very real problem in the universities, where at the moment quite a number of the top universities are lowering the requirements, entrance requirements, in order to attract colored students. And the effects of this are very important for the future of education in the States, particularly higher education. I find it very difficult. Anybody can doubt that this is an important issue and an interesting one.
John Vaser, did you...
Could he be asked again to answer that question? Because what you've said is important is admission policies of colleges. Now, that is important. Many other educational problems are extremely important, and they concern black and white children. But this is not to say it's worth going on arguing about perhaps a genetic difference between black and white.
All right, let's take another very important thing. Very large-scale projects have been started in the States, like Head Start and others, in an attempt to pull up the Negro child, improve his education, and equate, if possible, his IQ with that of whites. These have been based very much on an environmentalist kind of belief, and they have come to grief. The effect has been very poor. I'm not suggesting that this is necessarily so that you could not design better types of studies, but I agree there with Jensen that unless we know a great deal more about the effects of specific environmental influences on Negro and white intelligence, we're not likely to do any better than Head Start has done and various other types of programs.
Mr. Chairman, at this point, I would like to invite two of our audience who have said that they would like to say something at this point. Mr. Jada Khan is a mathematician, graduate of University College. Would you like to speak?
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I think personally If black men's IQ were really so small as we say it is, then how is it that the Moors conquered Spain? How is it that Hannibal conquered Rome? How is it that scientists like Washington, the peanut man? How is it that the Indians developed the zero concept, which makes computers, which developed the binary system of numbers? So IQ tests and the rest that goes with is a load of bullshit. Number two, psychology is a very young science. You can say it is a natural science, yes. But it is still not a science.
Mr. Jerrican, may I just say that
Yes.
if you do want your comments to go through,
Yes.
you might moderate your language.
See, I'm not speaking my own language, sir, because I'm speaking a different language. I've got a colonial mentality. It's not my language. If I were to speak my language, no one would really understand down here. So secondly, we've got to... Here was I, brother? Yes. Under what conditions does a science become a science? In order to establish that psychology is a science, we've got to consider under what conditions does any science become a science. Number one, there are a set of conditions that we will satisfy. Number one, it must be empirical. Number two, cumulative. Number three, speculative. And number four, it must be based on test, observation, and inference. Psychology simply uses a bit of statistics and they come up with intelligence tests.
Could we ask Mr. Mohammed if he would make his point?
Yeah, I think I'm concerned about the motivation, not only of Jensen and Eysenck, but also of the BBC in putting this program through. And it's quite clear to me that the basic idea to put this whole through and bring this bunch of people here is to prove white supremacy in Britain. Also, I think we're clearly excited that Jensen, Eysenck, and all these people are putting all this amount of money, all this amount of resources to prove that black children are inferior. If the basic idea was not, is to prove that the concept of white supremacy.
I think Professor John Rex feels rather the same.
Well, we live in a climate, Mr. Chairman, in which black people, in order that their voices shall be heard, have to shout and say extreme things. It is a legitimate question to ask, the question which has been asked, why this program, based upon very, very shaky scientific foundations, should be given such prominence in a new series in the BBC. Somebody only has to dig up a certain amount of secondary evidence, lard it with dirty limericks and pictures, and it will be discussed. One cannot really, in all fairness, take this as a serious scientific communication.
Could I add something to that? Professor, no, I'm sorry, Professor Eysenck, last word.
Well, on the whole, I don't feel that the objections that have been made to what I said really carry an awful lot of weight. I know, and I agree with Professor Penrose, that the precise proportion of heritability of intelligence can be argued about, like all scientific constants. Obviously, as I said in my talk, this is a very rough and ready figure at the moment, which one hopes in due course, by the use of better methods, larger samples and so on, to improve. To argue about the precise proportion when I deliberately stated that this is not important to my case, I think is simply going away from the important parts of the evidence. Now, obviously, all the critics are right in stressing the difficulties in coming to a final conclusion, and I explicitly stated again that no final conclusion at the moment is possible or is likely to be for a number of years. All what one can do at the moment, and all that I tried to do, was to look at the evidence insofar as it was relevant to this particular question and try to come, and it seems to me still, that the evidence points very strongly to an involvement of genetic factors in accounting for the observed differences, I'm not denying that it may not be possible to introduce new factors that have not hitherto been considered. But until this is done, and until we have some direct evidence pointing in the opposite direction, I'm still sticking with my conclusion that on the whole, the evidence at the moment tends in the direction I indicated.
Well, thank you, Professor Eysenck. Thank you, all our controversialists, everyone who's taken part in the program. A very controversial program. There will be another program in controversy on BBC Two on Monday of next week. Good night.